back to Old Testament. This week we'll be talking about King David. We'll be focusing on the stories of David in the books of Samuel and then into the very beginning of the book of Kings. So King David is a crucial figure for the history of ancient Israel and Judah. He remains an important figure for both Christianity and Judaism. But what we're going to talk about are the very specific narratives that we find in 1st and 2nd Samuel and into the very beginning of Kings, and we're going to read them, perhaps not in the way that you've read them before. That is, we're not going to think about King David and predetermine that he's a hero and then try to make all of his the stories about him sound wonderful and be in some way kind of a model for us as leaders in the Christian community. Instead, we're going to take a very close look at the very specific texts about David. We're going to read them carefully. And what we'll find is that David is an incredibly complex figure. He's not purely a bad guy, but sometimes the way that David is preached or he's taught, people will say things like that David made one big mistake with the incident with Bathsheba and Uriah, which often is misunderstood, I think, too. But it goes much deeper than that. David is simply a complex character, and part of the reason is that David is mixed up in the world of ancient Israelite politics. Now, you might say politics are boring, or they distract us from important things, or you can say the pursuit of politics and the interest in politics is just there's two sides that yell at each other, and who cares, or both sides have problems. So you might hear some dismissive content about this, or you might have heard people say that you shouldn't engage in politics as a Christian, that God is against the idea of politics, or that politics merely divides us and the church should unite us. I've heard a lot of these things through the years, but my argument is that politics, in fact, it's more than just the competition between two different political parties. It's more than just voting. Or getting angry at people on another side of a political divide. Instead of thinking about politics merely in terms of national political parties, let's try to think about politics as something that is much broader than that. Politics, if you get down to it, it's how a community structures its power and allocates its resources. That's the struggle. Right? It's always a conflict. It's always a struggle. There's a certain amount of resources, there's a certain amount of power, there's a certain organization or structure to communities, and there will always be arguments about structuring it differently, or different people having different access to the power or different access to the resources than currently exist. And when we engage in those kinds of conversations, we're engaging in politics. Every single human community has politics. Your church has politics. Your school, no matter what your school is, it has politics as a part of it. Your family is political. There is a certain structure of power and resources within your family of origin, within the family that you live in now. Your friend groups have certain political elements to them. Our cities and our towns, our counties, everything ends up with political dimensions, because everything in some way involves power and resources and our structure or our organization or our standing with one another. All of those things are political. We need to admit that this is just a part of our human condition. It's not a curse. It is. We have to do this because this is a big part of life. God entrusts us with these kinds of conversations. And when I say God entrusts us with these kinds of conversations, that's a way of me saying that we are all engaged in political theology. So political theology is the question, what role does God, or maybe we can say ethics, what role does the good play in our politics? When people talk about the common good and things like this, they're referencing some important ideas about what we would call transcendental qualities or something, something like the common good, right? Or it's evil to do this, right? It's evil to treat children this way, for example. And just one thing one might hear in a political conversation. People might not even say, they might say, I don't believe in God, or I don't care much about the idea of God. But they still are going to talk about politics. They're going to have core values or ideas about the way the world should be, ethical convictions that they bring with them to their political conversations. And all of those things we can talk about in terms of political theology. That is to say, this idea of what is God, or what is the good, and what does the good have to do with our politics. And often these conversations are submerged. Often we don't actually talk about our deep convictions, our deep assumptions about the world and the way it should be. One of the things I like about politics in the Bible is that it's fairly honest about the conflicts that you see between these different worldviews, and there's a struggle. The entire world is composed of a struggle between varying ways of understanding the world and each other and God, and we're engaged in that. So we can see this political struggle throughout the Bible. In the story of David, it comes to the surface. It's very clear. So we're going to talk about this struggle, this political struggle that David's involved in, which is corrupt in many ways. That is to say, we can't get away from the corruption. We are all a part of it because we are people. All human beings have this fault line between good and evil that runs through their hearts. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who was a very famous Russian author during the time of communism, he was an anti-communist writer, and he had this one line. He said, people believe that the line between good and evil runs between communities or between individual people, but instead that line runs through every human heart. And if we come to politics with that understanding in mind, maybe it will help us understand some of the problems or complications that will always come along with it. So what kind of politics does God want for Israel? Well, we're just to be clear, we're talking about ancient Israel as appears in the Bible, right? And in ancient archaeology, at least to some degree. We're not talking about contemporary political issues in Israel, which we could spend quite a long time discussing, and we will at some point in this class, but just not right now. We have a lot to do about ancient understandings of David for the time being. But I think it's important to say that there isn't just one political organization in the Bible that God gives to ancient Israel. Instead, God seems okay with several different political organizations. Or maybe we shouldn't say God is entirely okay with it, right? God is upset by the idea of kings, but also allows them to exist, and continues to work with Israel, even though kings exist in ancient Israel. But kings didn't used to exist, right? So that is to say that we've read about the book of Judges and so on. We've talked about the beginning of Samuel and this tribal league that existed. This is a bit of an unusual political organization for the ancient Near East, which typically revolves around kingship. Right? That idea that there's one person who is at the top of the social hierarchy, the pyramid of ancient societies, and then that person was in a way the arbiter of justice, who's like Hammurabi made laws and promulgated them, but also who was in charge of things like temples and making sure that gods got what they needed and wanted. But also this person would have been in charge of the armies and protecting the ancient peoples over whom they were king. And they would collect lots of taxes in exchange for this, right? And be honorarily thought of in many places, at least at the border of the gods, or perhaps even a god. That this individual kind of was at the boundary between humans and the divine. So in contrast to that, ancient Israel begins as a tribal league, right, with 12 or so tribes. As you saw in Judges chapter 5, there was a different listing of the tribes, different number of tribes, some tribes that we don't know about really, and they're being like Machir, which is called a tribe by Deborah. So all to say, this list might have been a little bit flexible in early Israel, but nonetheless we see these different families, clan-based or family-based political organizations that are related to one another, not in terms of domination, but they're related to one another in terms of cooperation. So that this is that basic idea of the Israelite Tribal League. Of course, there are problems with this, right? The Tribal League begins to fall apart, but you could see that the way that God was understood by the Israelite Tribal League was reflected in the kind of religious architecture and the ritual architecture that they had. Remember, they had a tabernacle. They didn't have a temple yet. The tabernacle moved around. It was made of cloth, and you could roll it up and bring it somewhere. And the ark was the portable throne of God, of Yahweh, and it would move around between the tribes. That is to say, the idea was that God didn't set up shop in any one particular place or favor any one particular tribe. Now, of course, that's going to change, but let's just keep in mind that this is the Ark of the Covenant is linked to a theology of God's movement, of God's mobility, of God's treatment, equal treatment of the tribes, and so on. Now, Israel was a tribal league in part because they distrusted kings, and it's pretty easy to see why they distrusted kings. We just read the book of Exodus, right? Israel did not have the best relationship with kings or experience of them, but also they experienced God to be in some way, Yahweh, the God of Israel, to in some way liberate them from oppressive kings. So this is why there was some resistance to the idea of kingship in early Israel. They consciously had a tribal league instead of kings because they rejected the idea of kings. And they expressed this in the idea that God was king, not Pharaoh. Right? The fight in Exodus is between Yahweh and Pharaoh, not between Moses and Pharaoh. Moses isn't a king. Isn't that an interesting thing about? Moses is not a king. Joshua is not a king. Those early Israelite leaders were not kings. They didn't have them, which would have seemed a bit strange to their neighbors. But here's one of the reasons they rejected kings. I mean, you can see this is an image from ancient Egypt, and there's a Pharaoh with his arm outstretched holding what looks like a big spatula or something, or maybe a feather, but really that's a sword, and he's about to chop off the heads of these various peoples he's holding their hair right there. This is Pharaoh trying to defend his homeland against foreigners, and you can notice that the faces and bodies of these people are reflected, they're imaged differently to reflect the Egyptians' understanding of how the different peoples around them looked, so that Pharaoh is protecting all of Egypt against all of these foreigners who are perceived to be threatening Egypt. And one of those are the ancient Hebrews, right? I mean, these were the idea that Pharaoh was going to dominate these folks. The idea was that it was us or them. If you read the beginning of Exodus chapter 1, it's seen as a struggle, right? That if they might overwhelm us, Pharaoh says. So then Israel is delivered from Pharaoh, and delivered by whom? By Yahweh, right? So there was no king who liberated Israel. So was there no king in Israel? Well, no, there was no king, but yes, there was a king, right? As I said, Yahweh is king, and you can see this reflected throughout the Bible. So look at like Psalm. If you turn to the 90s, are a good place to see some of these. So, for example, Psalm 97. Yahweh is king. Let the earth rejoice. Let the many coastlands be glad. Or Psalm 99. Yahweh is king. Let the peoples tremble. Or Psalm 93. Yahweh is king. Yahweh is robed in majesty. Yahweh is robed, is girded with strength, and so on. So these psalms were probably written and read during an enthronement festival. They probably had a festival every year, or something like it, where Yahweh was declared king. I mean, these were ritual texts here. So then when they got kings, right, Saul and then David, this was seen as an aberration. As you noticed in 1 Samuel chapters 8 through 12, there was that conversation about kings, right? Are kings good or bad? And Yahweh seems to kind of take both sides of that argument, right? And there are arguments to support that and to fight it all at the same time. But just to say that there were at least some people in ancient Israel who felt like it was treason against Yahweh to have a human king. That it was declaring your allegiance to a human instead of to God, and that it was going to, in some way, abandon one of the core distinctive principles of ancient Israelite theology and polity. Polity is like how we organize ourselves, right? Our political structure. So this distinctive thing about ancient Israel was being sold out, but it wasn't being sold out for no reason, right? There were threats that they were trying to respond to. This, by the way, is a carving from Ramses II, the pharaoh who fought and beat the Philistines. The Philistines came from the Greek islands in their boats and tried to land on Egypt's beaches near the Nile Delta, and they tried to defeat Ramses, the Egyptian emperor. They lost, and here they are, some of them at least, being taken as prisoners of war. You can see their arms are bound and so on, but they're wearing their distinctive Philistine headgear. But so these are defeated Philistines. But these Philistines then went from the ones that were not captured, left Egypt, and then they went to land on the beaches of what is now the Gaza Strip. So this land that became Philistia, or the Philistine cities, like Ekron. And Ashdod is another big one. So these Philistine cities were occupied by people who were willing to fight with Israel, right? So we also know that there were some other nearby polities that were willing to fight with Israel. We read about wars with Syria. We can read about fights with Moab. So as these different nascent nation states were starting to emerge around Israel, there was more conflict. That increased conflict put stress on the Israelite tribal league. That is to say, they didn't have a standing army. They didn't have one army that was a professional army for all of Israel. They had to call the tribes to show up and fight with each other if there was a threat. And the threats continued and increased and became more difficult for them to defend themselves against. So Philistines also had advanced technology, more iron smelting technology. They had more iron weapons. This is the beginning of the Iron Age. And according to Samuel, at least, there wasn't much iron smelting technology for the ancient Israelites who lived in the highlands. So, because they didn't have this technology, they were weak, and they also couldn't organize themselves effectively because they were a bunch of different tribes. So the rise of kingship is in some way response to this external crisis. There were also internal crises. We can see in the book of Judges that there's this decline, it seems. It's probably been organized that way, right, for literary effect. But it does seem like there was at least an understanding in ancient Israel that there was a decline in the effectiveness of the tribal league, and there was an increase in conflict amongst the tribes, even with civil war, as we saw in Judges 19 through 21, and that refrain in Judges that everyone did what was right in their own eyes. So this breakdown of the tribal league internally and the weakness externally combined to put a lot of pressure on ancient Israel to find a king, right? To generate a king. We also can pair this with this idea that there was a power vacuum in the Levant, well, really throughout all of the ancient Near East, in the early Iron Age. If you remember all the way back to the beginning of the class, I talked about the Bronze Age collapse. So at the end of the Bronze Age, near the year 1200 or so, there was an actual climactic shift. There were years of droughts throughout the ancient Near East, and there was a lack of water and a lack of food. And many of the major empires, like the Babylonians, like the Egyptians, the Assyrians, these different major peoples, the Hittites, these different groups collapsed in terms of their empires. And this is why the Philistines got into their boats and left their Greek islands and came to try to find another place to live, because they ran out of food and water, probably. But I say probably because we don't know, they didn't leave a lot of writings on those islands. But climactically, we can do some archaeobotany, and that is archaeology of living plants that used to be alive, and we can actually figure stuff out about this. So there was this major shift in the region, and when there were these major empires like Egypt that had dominated the Levant, when they retracted and receded because they had crises at home, and their armies left these areas, the local peoples formed more durable polities of their own, or political structures of their own, and more robust ones, including their own kingdoms. So the kingdoms of Syria, the Phoenician city-states, the kingdom of Moab, the kingdom of Ammon, the kingdom of Edom. These things arise in the early Iron Age precisely because there had been a power vacuum. The power vacuum was created by this Bronze Age collapse that extends into the early Iron Age. Israel's one of those people, so they're now competing with their neighbors in a way that they hadn't before. So before we jump into the details of the David story and his rise to kingship, it helps us to think a little bit about some of these images of kings. One of those being anointing. So throughout the ancient Near East, from Egypt all the way to Mesopotamia, anointing was a major deal. That if you wanted to set something apart, for ritual use or for God's special use, then you would anoint it by pouring oil on this thing in a ritual way. A certain kind of oil with a certain person pouring it, a holy person, a priest, in a certain kind of procedure, a certain ritual, a kind of context. Then you could call this thing anointed. And the Hebrew word for that is mashach, to anoint, which means to pour oil on something. And this is where the word Messiah comes from, or Meshiach. So if you want to get Meshiached or get Messiahed, you'd have oil poured over you. Now, in the ancient Near East, Messiah didn't mean a single person. It often didn't even mean a person. Anything could be turned in, set aside for God's special use and have oil poured over it or anointed. A Messiah meant a person that was set aside for God's special use. Often this was used to refer to kings as the very special person at the border between the human and the divine realm. And kings would be anointed on their coronation day. Here you see this image from ancient Egypt. You can see there's a pharaoh standing there in the middle. There's hands up at the top, right and left, and they're holding jars. These are alabaster jars, and these are two priests, Egyptian priests, and they're pouring oil over the king. But you can see the oil comes down in two kind of lines, and those are represented with Ankh crosses or Egyptian crosses, which is the Egyptian symbol for life. So this king is getting new life on the king's coronation day. This was a very common idea throughout the ancient Near East, and it was common in Israel too. Psalm chapter 2, Psalm 2 is we don't usually use the word chapter with Psalms because they're individual poems, really. But it's not like a story with chapters, right? But in any event, so Psalm 2 is a psalm that was read on the coronation day of an ancient Israelite king. And you can read this psalm. There are kings that are upset and want to burst their cords asunder or something like this in verses 1 through 3. And then God laughs at them. And God says in verse 6, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. So there's kings that want to fight with Israel, but God has set the Israelite king, or the Judahite king here, on Zion, the holy hill. That is Jerusalem. And then somebody says in verse 7, I will tell of the decree of the Lord. God said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. This is the king saying this. So the king, on the king's coronation day, the day that the God sets the king on the holy hill, the day that the king is crowned, then the king says, I heard from God, and God said, you are my son, today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage, and the ends of your earth your possession. So, you are my son, today I have begotten you. You might remember that from the baptism of Jesus, right? This sounds pretty familiar, I'm sure. This was quoted from Psalm 2. The idea that this was, you are my son, this is spoken of Jesus. Before that, it was spoken of the Davidic kings. So the understanding was not that God had given birth to the Davidic king on that day. This would have been a grown person most of the time, right? This was the day they were crowned. But instead, the king was understood to be kind of adopted by God, that Yahweh had adopted. This is also the way that the Egyptians would talk about this, that on the day of coronation, the pharaoh or king was adopted by the gods on that day and became a kind of honorary god. In Mesopotamia, they were a little bit more resistant to the idea that the king actually became a god. The king was like at the border of the gods. And in Egypt, they said, yes, this is now the king becomes a true god on that day when the pharaoh is adopted by the gods. In Israel, it seems like they were not. They were more like the Mesopotamians. They didn't actually believe that the kings became gods. But nevertheless, there was this kind of symbolic adoption by God. God, you are my son, right? This is not only said of Jesus in the Bible. It's said in a different way about Jesus, but that's building on an earlier idea, an earlier metaphor. You can see this throughout. We'll read many stories where God calls David my son, and where God refers to the kind of lineage of the Davidites as like my son. So, all to say, you are my son, today I have begotten you. This is kind of an adoptionistic way of thinking about the anointing. And the king of Israel would have had oil poured over them in a ritual, and they would have been called anointed, or the Messiah. The anointed one, yeah, there's another, just an image. This is Naram Sin, who is a very famous ancient Akkadian king, and he's famous in part because of this very stone itself. It's at the Louvre. Here he is marching up a hill, killing his enemies, and he's got horns on his head to show that they actually thought that they were kings. The Assyrians didn't like this, and they said, no, they are not. Our kings are not gods. But the ancient Akkadians thought that. The king would also often have trappings that were semi-divine, like cherub thrones. You know how the gods sat on thrones that were formed by the wings of cherubim, or these lion-bodied, human-headed, winged animals? Well, kings would often have cherubs on their thrones too, because they were sort of semi-divine, right? Here's an actual cherub, bit of a cherub image from a throne from ancient Israel. This is from Samaria. It was taken after the destruction of Samaria to ancient Assyria, where it was found in an archaeological discovery. Another important image of ancient kings throughout the ancient Near East is the image of the shepherd. So here we see a Dumuzi, a Sumerian shepherd, and he was famous throughout the ancient Near East, but he was kind of understood in a divine way. And so here you see this, like, carrying the lamb, right? This was a big metaphor that the gods would carry the people like lambs in some way and would rescue them. But then also that was then put onto the kings themselves, who were supposed to be representatives of the gods in some way and caring for the people. That was at least the idea that they were supposed to live up to, right? So here we see Gudea of Lagash. Lagash was a major city of ancient Sumeria. Gudea was one of the most famous kings of that city in the ancient world. And here you see two images of him wearing a knit cap, just like you'd see many people in America wear on a cold winter day, a knit cap that you roll up, and it's just knitted out of wool. And he wore this cap because it was what shepherds would wear. So this was the beginning of a crown. Kings wore crowns because they derived from this very ancient practice of wearing a shepherd's hat. Now, shepherds were often poor, and often young and so on, but the kings adopted this not because it made them look nice or that it was a symbol of honor, but because it was symbolic. It told the people, I am your shepherd, I will care for you. So this metaphor goes all the way back before the origins of writing. It's very, very old, the idea that the king should be something of a shepherd of the people. The idea that they were a shepherd also meant that they should defend from animals, so especially predators, right? The shepherds were supposed to defend their flock from predators like wolves and lions. And so here you see, this is the royal seal of Neo-Assyria. Just like today, if the president of the United States, say, gets up to give a speech, it'll be at a podium with that symbol of the seal of the United States of America. It's got an eagle on it and so on. But here, this is the seal of ancient Neo-Assyria. So if you got something with this on it, you would know that the king had sent it to you. And here you can see it has the king of Neo-Assyria who is stabbing a lion. The idea is that the king was protecting you from the wild animals. The lion didn't really mean a lion. What this symbolizes are the forces of evil in the world, the forces of chaos, foreign armies that want to take your land and so on and do harm to you and your family. That the king was the protector against all of these different things symbolically, right? They would actually act this out sometimes. The kings of Assyria would keep lions as pets, and then they would ride a chariot around and shoot arrows into them, and then when the lions were quite harmed, they would come up to them and actually kill the lion. I'm not telling you this to be gruesome, but just to say they enacted this symbol and everyone knew it. And people in ancient Israel knew this symbol. We have images of this symbol from ancient Israel. That is to say, like, you can dig these up. When the kings of Assyria would communicate with either the northern kingdom of Israel or the kingdom of Judah, they would actually send these pictures of this seal. Now, these things will come back later in our discussion. Just I want to lay all this symbolism out so that you can pick it up as we move along. Okay, so let's actually think about David a little bit then. We are going to read David closely and slowly, carefully, not with the Sunday school kind of wistfulness about kings, that they're all good or that they represent Jesus entirely, 100%. That is to say, I do think David foreshadows Jesus in some ways, but also David does not foreshadow Jesus in some very distinct and important ways. One of the issues with human kings taking the place, like, a human actually stepping into kingship, is that it's always a temptation. There's always a major temptation there, and that you can see this throughout the Bible, that any person who takes on immense power, this is reserved for Yahweh, and something, Yahweh is king because Yahweh can handle kingship. Yahweh can still be a good king, but no person can be a good king in the Bible. In the Old Testament, you can go from one end to the other, and you shouldn't find heroes. Now, there's no person in the Old Testament who's a pure hero. Everyone has their problems. Everyone has their faults, because only God, right, is a true hero. If you read an ancient Old Testament story and you come away with a human hero in the end, you should probably go back and read it again. That's a little lesson from Chunliang Seao, who's a wonderful biblical scholar, one of my professors, and Professor Yoder's professors from our time in seminary. But he said that quite often, and I agree with him, that if you read a story in the Bible and you come away with a human hero, a purely human hero, you need to go back and read it again. One of the struggles that we see throughout the story of David, but also that goes throughout all of the kingship in ancient Israel, is this struggle. Once people get an inordinate amount of power, will they turn into Pharaoh? Will Pharaoh's politics come back and haunt us? God frees us from Pharaoh, but how do we get the Pharaoh out of us? How do we make a system that's actually different? And you can see in the law that God tries to begin making a new system, a different system, where everyone has access to land in perpetuity and it can't be taken away from them. At least it shouldn't. That if someone gives away their land or ruins their access to the land for future generations, or if someone gives it away, gambles it away or something, or drinks it away, that it gets returned to their family in future generations with the Jubilee, right? Everyone has a nachala, that access to the land. Everyone has their inheritance. This is a crucial thing, but also that if someone happens to make some bad decisions, or by fortune or chance or luck, bad luck or evil, they are dispossessed of their land or dispossessed of their possessions and so on, and they become destitute, there are things in the Bible that tell them, here's what you're supposed to do, right? You're supposed to actually have money and resources. You're supposed to have food to be able to give to them. In a time of need, they were to have access to the things they needed to live. Also, a very basic understanding in ancient Israel is that every single person matters. That everyone is made in the image of God. That people aren't by nature servants or slaves of the gods. That people exist, that people are marvelous in their very existence. This is a theological but also a political idea. Remember that God makes a covenant with all of the people of Israel. Everyone is there. Everyone gets to say yes or no. That God speaks to all of them personally and corporately. This is a radical idea in ancient Israel, that kings would treat a group of people as a political entity themselves, rather than speaking to a king who dominated and ruled a bunch of people. So that is to say that ancient Israel has this alternative structure of politics, of resources, of power, that has been laid out in the law. And the law does mention a king, but remember what it says in Deuteronomy 17. The only thing it says about kings is that here's a king's job. Don't acquire lots of stuff. Don't acquire lots of wives. Don't acquire lots of horses. Don't make a lot of alliances with other kingdoms to increase your own power, and trade deals with other kingdoms to increase your power. Instead, what you're supposed to do is read the Torah every day, and that's it. That's what kings are supposed to do. This is like a slap in the face to ancient kings. That is to say, ancient Israel embodies a very different kind of political structure than the peoples around them. And there seems to be kind of a fear there that if anyone does ascend to the position of king, that they will begin to acquire things and make alliances and so on to increase their power. They'll take things from you, as we saw in 1 Samuel 8, right? He'll take. That this is going to lead to Pharaoh, that having a king turns people into Pharaoh, and that question is kind of haunts ancient Israelite literature. Will Pharaoh's politics come back? This is the open question. Can you build a political system that actually works, that actually serves the people, that actually does what it's supposed to do? We've tried, but there are always problems. So this is where we live, right? So about David, there are David is associated with the rise to true Israelite kingship. Saul is never quite described fully as a king, like he has to go out and plow his own field in 1 Samuel 15. I mean, he's not living the high life. But David is actually, he does seem to actually function as a true ancient Near Eastern king. So he's the really true beginning of the tradition of kingship. So what we've got with David is a truly complex picture, though, and he is a truly complex figure. The reason I say this is because we even look at his origin stories, and there are actually 3 different origin stories, all of which disagree with each other about some key things. We can see that there's this shift towards David, right, in chapter 15 of 1 Samuel. In 1 Samuel 15, verse 10, the word of the Lord comes to Samuel, I regret that I made Saul king, right? God's pretty upset, and God begins to turn to finding someone else, right? So the problem is that we have an anointed. We have an anointed person. That's Saul. Saul got anointed by Samuel, God's prophet, and God doesn't unanoint Saul. So we have this really interesting issue here that we have 2 anointeds at the same time. How do you do that? We don't have 2 presidents of the United States at the same time. We have a president-elect sometimes while concurrently with the president, but there's a clear structure of time and power. The shift is written out in advance. Here we have this awkward double anointing, and that starts in chapter 16. So our first introduction to David is that he is this story in chapter 16, verse 1, of Samuel finding David, right? So God says to Samuel, how long are you going to grieve over Saul? I've rejected him from being king over Israel. So God is turning pretty quickly on Samuel and is already upset with Saul. God is turning on Saul very quickly, and God is already upset with Samuel for not shifting as fast as God, right? So God says, how long are you going to grieve over Saul? I've rejected him from being king over Israel, but God doesn't take away the anointing. It doesn't say that, and Saul remains king for quite some time. So this is interesting. God says, I fill your horn with oil to anoint, right, and set out. By the way, this is the earliest picture of David that we have, or one of them. This is from a Jewish synagogue, actually, in a place called Dura Europos, which is in Syria. And today it's in the National Museum in Syria. It's kind of in a basement area. It's a little bit hard to get access to it. Well, during COVID, it's probably very hard to get access to it. But nonetheless, this is an image of Samuel here. Samuel is standing in the larger man in the toga, and these are the sons of Jesse here, and you can see he's got this horn of oil that he's pouring over David, the one standing kind of in the front. This is from about the right around the year 250 AD. So, in any event, God tells Samuel to fill his horn with oil and set out. God says, I'll send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided for myself a king among his sons. So there's a family, and then one of those guys, we don't know which one it is yet, right? Neither does Samuel. So Samuel says, how am I going to go? If Saul hears of it, he'll kill me. So there's a clear problem here. But God doesn't say, don't worry, I'll get rid of Saul for you or something, or I'll tell Saul that he's been fired or something like that. God then tells him, gives him this ruse, this like scheme where he's going to be able to find out which of Jesse's sons it is, but also have it not look too conspicuous. So in any event, verse 6, he looked on Eliab. He gets all Jesse's sons out there once he shows up at Jesse's house. He looks on Eliab and he thought, surely this kid is the anointed, right? This is the Messiah. Not Messiah like the end of days Messiah or Jesus, just meaning the king who's going to help us. This is the person who's going to save us from the Philistines, from the foreign powers that are trying to hurt us, from the tribal conflicts that we have inside the tribal coalition. So this is the one who's going to help us, right? This is the king. But God then says to Samuel, do not look upon his appearance or his height or his stature, because I have rejected him. The Lord does not see as mortals see. They look on the outward appearance, but God looks at the heart. Okay, so we're not supposed to look at this person's outward appearance. Okay, great. So then, of course, the other sons come out, and they aren't it. And then finally, Jesse is asked by Samuel, isn't there anyone else? He goes, well, there's that kid out, the really, really little kid who's out there in the field with the sheep, right? And Samuel says, okay, bring him in here, right? So he sends him, brings him. And then verse 12. Now, remember, we're not supposed to look at the exterior of the person here. We just learned that. He sent and brought him in. But now he, that is David, was ruddy and had beautiful eyes, and he was handsome. I thought we weren't supposed to notice those things. But anyway, the Lord said, rise and anoint him, for this is the one. So then Samuel takes the horn of oil, and he anoints David in the presence of his brothers. It sounds a little bit like the Joseph story there, right? I mean, we'll see there's some conflict there in a minute. And the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon David from that day forward. So, again, he's anointed, and the Spirit comes on him. This is the idea of kingship, is that the king, when the king gets anointed, that God's Spirit fills the king. And, it works, it's really God working through the king. Again, this is fairly common in the ancient Near East, actually, the idea that the gods are working through the king in order to do the right thing. So, Jesus' baptism is not totally unique in the history of the world in terms of its symbolism. I do think it's totally unique in the world in other ways, right? But just to say, it participates in an ancient Near Eastern understanding of symbols that goes back to very ancient days, and people would have understood, right? People would have understood what it meant for Jesus to be baptized and anointed in that way in the waters, and for the Spirit to come on him, and for this, you are my son, right? The beloved. So, all to say that this is, we're learning a bit more about that kind of ancient tradition. But what's strange, though, so we hear this initial story, right? This initial story about David being kind of handsome, but also overlooked. But, we have a little bit of tension there. But now the second introduction here. Watch this, verse 14. Now the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul. Now we heard the Spirit went into David. Well, the Spirit had left Saul, but the anointing hadn't left Saul. That is to say, everyone still treats him, and David treats him as the anointed of God. So that's a problem too. But this evil spirit from the Lord tormented him. Now, you might say, why did God send an evil spirit? Right? Is God in charge of the evil spirits? Does God work with them? Probably important here to say that evil in the Hebrew word for evil, ra'ah, in ancient Hebrew, didn't mean evil in the sense of always meaning like pure evil. It didn't mean like a demonic figure necessarily. When someone says this is evil to me, what they meant in ancient Hebrew was this is bad, I don't like it. This is bad to me. So there's a story in 1 Kings chapter 22 where God sends evil spirits to go and lie to one of a king. And those spirits are evil, not in the sense that they're like demons, but they're evil in the sense that they're doing something that king doesn't want to do. They're evil to the king. They're bad to the king. They do things the king doesn't want to do. So it's saying evil in ancient Hebrew is a bit like saying like from the perspective of the person to whom the action is coming. Do they perceive it as good or bad? They would call that evil. So this spirit who wants to do bad to Saul comes and torments him, and it comes from God. So Saul's servants then say to him, see now, this evil spirit from God is tormenting you. Let our Lord now command the servants who attend you to look for someone. Right? So they want to go find someone else who is skillful in playing the lyre, a harp. They want a musician, right? Musical therapy, which don't laugh. I mean, it's an actual thing, and it works. And when an evil spirit from God is upon you, he'll play it, and you'll feel better. It's an ancient form of therapy. So Saul says to his servants, provide me someone who can play well, and bring him to me. And then one of the young men answered, I have seen a son of Jesse the Bethlehemite who's skillful in playing, a man of valor, a warrior, prudent in speech, and a man of good presence, and Yahweh is with him. So Saul sent messengers to Jesse and said, send me your son David who's with the sheep. So we see this really strange picture here of a guy who is apparently a skillful, famous musician and a famous warrior and prudent in speech, someone who like doesn't talk too much. He's careful and wise with his words. And then he's also this like shepherd kid. David was so little that his dad didn't even send him in, and his kind of small stature would have made Samuel not even consider him for the role of king. But then we also hear him being a warrior, a major warrior, man of valor. That's a thing used. That's a phrase used to describe someone who is a true warrior. So this is just a really strange juxtaposition, right? There's two stories next to each other that are a bit strange. So then David comes and works for Saul, and in verse 21, Saul loved him greatly, and he became his armor bearer. That means he carried the armor for Saul. And Saul said to Jesse, "Let David remain in my service, for he has found favor in my sight." And then he would play this music, right? But then in chapter 17, we have this third introduction, which is entirely different from the other two that we've just read. Now the Philistines gather for battle, and they're gathered at this place called Soko. In this story, there's a point at the climax of this story, which I'll point out. Let's just look at it right now. And this is the story of David and Goliath, right? And in this story, David is unknown to Saul, and he's a shepherd, right? Now, you'd think that Saul would know that his famous musician that he had hired for his court to help him feel better, like whenever he feels bad, he's hired by this guy. This is an an Ethiopian image, by the way, of David from an Ethiopian psalter, and he's playing the lyre there, a stringed instrument. And so this idea that, he's a famous musician and warrior, but also he's not fighting in the battles in chapter 17, and Saul seems to not know who he even is, and there's no mention of his musicianship in chapter 17. Remember, Saul says, like, "Who is this guy?" Right? I don't even know who this guy is, right? This guy is just a boy. Verse 33, Saul said to David, "You're not able to go against the Philistine, you're just a boy." And he's been a warrior from youth. So, how in the world do these stories fit together, right? David is an incredibly complex figure, in part because these three stories don't really fit together terribly well. God is working in all three of these stories, but which one comes first? You can't arrange them in a way where they all make sense together. So what we have are these different origin stories for David that seem to presuppose some different things about him, some different aspects of his personality. But this third one, let's take a look at this, chapter 17 real quick. This, by the way, is a sculpture from Bernini, an famous Italian Renaissance sculptor. And this is a cool sculpture because you can walk all the way around it, and it continues to change. Like, it seems like a completely different sculpture as you move around it. It makes him look like he's actually throwing the sling as you move around. In any event, so now the Philistines in chapter 17. Philistines gathered their armies for battle. They were gathered at Soko, which belongs to Judah, and encamped between Soko and Azekah, in Ephes Dammim. So Saul and the Israelites gathered and encamped in the valley of Elah and formed ranks against the Philistines. So there's a battle that's about to happen, and they decided to do this champion thing, right? Instead of all fighting the battle, they're going to pick one person from each army to fight, and the winner wins, right? And the loser's army has to give up, right? There's an interesting thing here. It's Goliath, right, who is said to be 6 cubits and a span, which ends up being a very, very tall figure. There's actually a discrepancy here, a dispute. But you can see that letter A there above 6. It says Masoretic text. That means the Bible that we basically have here. But then it says Q, that's Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls. And then manuscript GK, that's Greek. The Greek manuscript from Qumran says 4 cubits, not 6, which would make him like 6 foot 8 inches instead of 10 feet. So that is to say, there's a discrepancy here about how tall Goliath is, even in ancient manuscripts. But and he's got this bunch of mail, this armor on. And then verse 7, the shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam. So he's got this giant spear. It was like this. It's like saying that. His spear was like the size of a house or something. It's just a giant thing, or less, the size of like a pillar on a house. So he stood and he shouted, "You're gonna fight me," and so on. And then verse 12. So David, the armies of Israel are worried, right? They're who's going to go fight this guy? Now David, we have this cross cut, right? Now David was the son of an Ephrathite of Bethlehem in Judah named Jesse. I'm just going to read this once again. What kind of remark is this? Now David was the son of an Ephrathite of Bethlehem in Judah named Jesse. This is an introduction. Why is it strange that this introduction shows up here in the middle of chapter 17? Because we've already been introduced to David twice. That is to say, we've got 3 different introduction stories, probably preserved from 3 different sources that have been integrated together. And remember, in ancient Israel, they know that these stories don't all make sense together, that there are overlaps and some areas of tension between these stories. And they decide not to fix all that, because if they make it all the same, they're going to take out some of the individual elements of these stories that give them unique voices. So they want to preserve the voices, these different ancient voices about where David came from. So they preserve this introduction here. So there's all these older kids they're all going to fight, and David is left behind, and he's taking care of the sheep. He's the youngest. And then verse 17, Jesse said to his son David, take to your brothers an ephah, this parched grain and all this stuff. Take some supplies to your brothers because they're running out of food, probably in the battle, right? So David then goes. It says David goes and tried to find his brothers and so on. He came. This is verse 20. In the middle of verse 20, he came to the encampment as the army was going forth in the battle line, shouting the war cry, Taruah. Israel and the Philistines drew up for battle, army against army, and David left things in charge of the keeper of the baggage, and he ran to the ranks and went and he greeted his brothers. He wanted to see his brothers, right? He's a nice guy. As he talked to them, now just pay attention to this, because here we see something about David. Not all positive, but not all negative too. So, verse 23, as he talked with them, his brothers, the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, came and spoke to the ranks. He's screaming, right? And David heard him. And then all the Israelites, verse 24, all the Israelites, when they saw this Goliath guy, they ran from him. They were afraid. And they said, have you seen this guy who's come up? Surely he's come up to defy Israel. The king will enrich the man who kills him, and he will give his daughter and make his family free in Israel. So, if you kill this Goliath guy, you get rich and you marry the king's daughter, which means you become royalty. Because as soon as you get a king, you all of a sudden get this major distinction in hierarchy, a position. Now you get classes that are very clear. Whereas in the laws, right, the idea is you don't have a king and an aristocracy, right? You don't have this like upper class. But now you do. And this gives you access to it. There's not much social mobility in the ancient world, but this is an opportunity. So David then says to the men who stood by him, what shall be done for the man who kills the Philistine, who takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? David's, remember he's a kid, he's a little kid. Who is this dog that he's going to defy the armies of the living? This kid's speaking a little big for his britches, right? He's got a lot of courage. You can see that here. He has an amazing amount of courage for who he is, for his position. And then verse 27, the people answered him in the same way. Well, so shall it be done for the man who kills him. So, in other words, if you can kill him, you can get rich. And bing! That light goes off in his head, right? His eldest brother Eliab heard him talking to the men, and Eliab got really angry with David. David's brother gets angry at him. Why? He said, why did you come here? Why did you come here? With whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? Remember, David's job is to come here, drop off the food, and then get back before the wolves eat his sheep, right? And his brother says, you're still here. You're still here in the camp. You're here when they're talking about how that whoever kills Goliath's going to get rich, right? And then Eliab, his brother, says, I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you have come down here just to see the battle. I know you, David. His brother tells him, I know you want to get ahead. You think there's some opportunity here. And David said, what have I done now? It was only a question. Which maybe he's saying innocently, but then he turned away toward another and spoke in the same way, and the people answered him. So his brother says, you're trying to get rich here in battle. Go home and help Dad and make sure our animals don't get eaten instead of trying to get rich here on the battlefield, buddy. And he goes, hey, what did I do? And then he turns to the next person, hey, so seriously, am I going to get rich if I kill Goliath? This is this is a little insight into who David is. From the very moment that he steps onto the scene, he's complicated. He's complicated in part because he's incredibly brave, and because he's looking out for himself in some way. He's tempted by this power, money, status, wealth, and all of that is going to stick with him his entire life. David is going to be a mixture of courageous and brave and bold, and looking out for number one, that is himself. So then, when verse 31, when the words that David spoke were heard, they were repeated before Saul, and Saul sent one. So somebody said, hey, this kid's like bragging about how he's going to kill the Philistine. Saul says, well, bring him here because everyone else is scared, right? In verse 32, David said to Saul, let no one's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight this Philistine. So David said, everyone else is scared? I'm not. I'm going to go fight him. Saul said to David, you are not able to go against the Philistine. You're just a boy, right? This sounds a lot different than chapter 16, verse 18, which says, I know this guy who's a skilled warrior, a man of valor, right? Okay, so this story in chapter 17 presupposes he's a kid who can't fight. So Saul said, you're not able to go fight him. You're just a boy, and he's been a warrior from his youth. And then verse 34, David said to Saul, your servant used to keep sheep for his father. Whenever a lion or bear came and took a lamb from the flock, I went after it, and I struck it down. I rescued the lamb from its mouth, and if it turned against me, I would catch it by the jaw, and I would strike it down, and I would kill it. Your servant has killed both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, since he has defied the armies of the living God. Grabbing a lion by the jaw or the hair and killing it to defend others who are vulnerable or weak, this is a sign of a king. So we can see that David is the Lord of animals. David is he's a king in miniature, and eventually he ends up realizing that fully. But here at the end of this story, also in verse 37, David said, "The Lord Yahweh, who saved me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, will save me from the hand of the Philistine." And then Saul said, "Go, and may Yahweh be with you." And of course, Yahweh was with him, right? David ends up succeeding. And then, of course, afterwards, Saul doesn't know who David was, right? Verse 55, Saul says, Abner, who is this guy? Right, go find out who this kid is. Whose son are you? And he says, I'm the son of your servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite. Okay, so several different things here in this story that all emerge kind of at the same time. I mean, one is that David is chosen by God to be prepared for this kind of work, right, of protecting the people of Israel. And we can see that here. At the same time, David is also afflicted with an intense desire to get ahead, to get what's his, to get money, to get power, to marry into the royal family. And his brothers know that, and they call him out on it. And he responds by getting the power and, just going with his plan anyway. At the same time, David is also fully invested in Yahweh. David believes that Yahweh is going to protect him no matter what. And the reason that he believes this is he is full of faith. David really does believe that God is going to save him, because just like God saved him from the lions when he was protecting his flock, God's going to save him from the Philistine. David is both full of a courageous kind of faith and full of his own quest for his own power and his own self. And both of those things are I'm going to stop this video now. The next video will actually focus on this tension as we can see it form and take shape, really, in chapter 18 of 1 Samuel on. But also we're going to talk a little bit about 2 Samuel 7 and the Davidic covenant that comes about. So that'll be our next video. See you then.